Let's have a quick conversation about how to build a podcast that scales into a business this year. The whole idea, when you start a podcast, the whole idea is not just to, let's say, accumulate a followership. The whole idea is not just to make money on year one or year two or year three or even the first 5 years. The whole idea is to really build a stable foundation for recurring revenue. So you want to scale into a business. So let me first tell you what you have to do. You want to define and research your audience. See, the whole thing is if you want to build a podcast that scales into a business, the business part of things means that you are actually selling to a certain audience. So you got to have a clear idea about the audience. And by audience, I mean the psychographics of the audience. I mean, I don't care about the location or the age bracket, but you have to also pay attention to the psychology of the audience. The psychology means what? They have pain points, they have issues, they have frustrations, they have challenges in their lives, and you are bringing a solution through your podcast. Okay, so you want to research things like age, location, gender, pain points, life goals, so you have a clear idea about what kind of audience you're really talking to. That's really important if you want to really build a podcast that scales into a business. If you know your audience pretty well, you'll be able to bring to market to bring the kind of content they want to hear, which means what? You are having followers for life. You have regular followers. They are really tuning in and they're listening to you, right? So you are actually speaking to their issues. The second thing you want to do, if you are trying to build a podcast that scales into a business, you got to really take care of your gear. You know, your gear is really important. You want to invest in good quality podcast equipment. The whole thing is that don't try to be cheap, but don't try to be expensive too. I'm not asking you to spend thousands of dollars on top-notch gear. No, but you want to have decent gear because your gear is going to really be reflected in the quality of the audio or the quality of the video. So when people tune in, when your listeners tune in, they want to have a good experience. You know, this is called LX, listener experience. You want to improve the listener experience. So think about your computer. You can set up your own podcast studio with your computer, your podcast recording software, headphones, an external microphone with a stand, and a pop filter to diffuse harsh sounds like P or T. If you want to build a podcast that scales into a business this year, I want you to also think about storytelling. Storytelling is really critical. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that you need to create a narrative for each episode. So every episode has to have a story. There has to be a foundational story, and then you can really add you can add on ancillary stories to it. So you have a primary story, and then you have secondary stories or tertiary stories, okay? So the foundation has to be there, okay? So, and the way you do this is by creating a narrative. You want to really create a narrative because a great podcast episode has a beginning, middle, and end. So these are actually the basic building blocks of a narrative. So you are speaking about a trifecta. So a trifecta of a narrative is actually a structure that makes your podcast easy to understand. So before you actually start recording a new episode, spend time really outlining the narrative with a podcast script. So some of the most popular podcasts use the following narrative structure. So you have a hook, you have a rising action, explanation, so that's the backstory. You have climax, falling action, and resolution. So this applies even to non-narrative podcasts. There is no reason your interview show needs to follow the same timeline of the interview recording, because if you reorder the questions and answers to follow the structure that I just gave you a little earlier, you will create a much more compelling conversation. That's what you want. You want to create a compelling conversation. You want to hook the audience. You want to hook your guest. You want everybody to be engaged, okay? You also need to practice good recording techniques. If you are trying to build a podcast that scales into a business, think about your recording. Think about your techniques. Think about the tone. Think about the seasonality, the frequency, okay? Find a quiet recording space. Warm up beforehand. Wear headphones. Mute yourself when others speak. Those are really, I would say, basic things, but they're very important. That's what I call podcasting etiquette. If you're trying to really make sure that you want to build a podcast that scales into a business, you got to really stick to a great podcast etiquette, okay? Find a quiet recording space. This could be your basement. This could be your office. This could be This could be your home office too, okay? But it has to be quiet, and there are ways to actually create that kind of environment. If you don't have, let's say, if you have a noisy neighborhood or no noisy home, there are ways to actually create a quiet recording space. I actually covered this in another video, so if you are interested in that sort of topic, let me know in the comment section, and I'll certainly direct you to that video. If you are trying to build a podcast that scales into a business this year, you want to edit and polish your podcast episodes. Now, I'm not asking you to do this yourself, okay? You can actually just outsource this to a third party. So there are a lot of organizations that do this for a living. So that's kind of cool because then they've got the expertise, they've got the acumen, they have the experience, they've got the skill set too, okay? So the reason why you want to edit and polish your podcast episodes is that basically you want to remove, for instance, unwanted background noise. So that's for the studio sound. You can have a automated transcription with more than 95% accuracy. You can remove filler words such as or Yeah. And you have AI voices to fix audio mistakes with a clone of your natural voice. You also want to record an intro and outro for every podcast that you put out there in the whole world to see. Okay. So, unlike TV series, people don't always listen to new podcasts from the first episode. Okay. Even established podcasts, folks don't have time nowadays. People are really busy. They are bombarded by so many things happening. So, you got to really be very creative in how you hook them. And the intro and outro can help you. Okay. So, new listeners, for instance, might join you midway through your podcasting journey. So, you want to get them up to speed with a short podcast introduction that hooks them in, reinforces the name of your show, and gives them a brief insight into the host or hosts they are listening to. Okay, so you got to give a brief bio of your host. So I was actually talking to you about the fact that the end of your podcast is also valuable because you're able to summarize the key points you've made and give readers a call to action. Okay, so when I say a call to action, you can ask them to leave their feedback. You can ask them to follow you on social media or subscribe to the show on the podcast player they're actually using to listen. This can be an Apple Podcast or Google Podcast or Amazon or even Spotify. So if you want to build a podcast that scales into a business this year, I want you to really think about choosing a reliable podcast hosting platform. See, the whole thing is I've already established in other videos that you do not want to really host. You do not want to, let's say, archive your podcast on your own website. This is not good. You have a lot of hosting platforms out there. They have the experience, they have the platform, then they have the technology to really do it for you. So a podcast hosting platform is actually the virtual home for your show. So it's actually the place where the audio file, episode title, and show notes are hosted and distributed across different podcast listening platforms. Okay. So popular podcast hosting platforms include Captivate, Buzzsprout, Acast, Transistor, Podbean, Castos. You have Riverside, and so on and so forth. So once you have chosen one, you want to upload your first episode, or even better, a podcast trailer to the hosting service. You want to add the name and cover art for your show, then grab the RSS feed link. You can automatically distribute new podcast episodes to directories like Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify. Okay, once you get the link. You also want to write compelling titles and show notes every time you have a podcast if you want your show to scale into a business. Because titles and shows do something very fantastic. Why? They give a glimpse into each episode and convince listeners to tune in. And you want listeners to tune in. You want lots of listeners to tune in. So those show notes, those compelling titles, they also help with your podcast SEO strategy. So if a search engine or a podcast algorithm knows what you're talking about, it's more likely to display your episode in your target audience's search results. So if you want to optimize every element, think about how to optimize the title. Make the podcast title less than 60 characters. And for the show notes, you can really you just want to add the phrases someone might search to find your show, right? This is really important. So if you want to really build a podcast that scales into a business this year, I want you to really invite podcast guests on your show. You can't do it yourself all the time if you want to scale. If you want to expand to new territories, to new audiences, you want to really embrace other people's audiences, other people's point of views, other people's points of view, other people's perspective. And the way you do this is through a conversation. Okay, gone are the days where you can just scale your podcast into a business if you just stick to the monologue, let's say, tone. No, you want to have a dialogue. You want to have a conversation. You want to have a group session. You want to, not group session, but let's say a group conversation, if you will. Okay. So even if you do a solo show, it's always good to mix things up by inviting other people to join maybe for a special episode. Podcast guests have the potential to add new, interesting perspectives to your show and bring their own audiences along the way to potentially become fans of your show too. Okay, so good podcast guests could be social media influencers with thousands of followers, experts in their field, for example, a forensic psychologist if you are hosting a true crime podcast, and also a podcast listener who wants to share their own experience. So that's really cool. And what you want to do also is that you want to really promote your podcast using video snippets. So turning your audio only podcast into a videos podcast is a great way to diversify your content and reach people who prefer to watch their content instead of just listening to it. So unlike audio only shows, you can also upload video podcasts to YouTube, which is really the second largest search engine in the world with over 2 to 3 billion users. The best part is you can use snippets of your video podcast to promote it on social media. So video content is proven to perform best on platforms like TikTok, for instance, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So by creating video clips of podcast segments, you could actually you could tease your show and give social media followers a glimpse into every single episode. So that's kind of cool. That's really a fantastic opportunity in terms of scaling fast. Okay, now a podcast transcript also can help you maximize the value that you get from your episode. Okay, so that's kind of cool. If you want to really build a podcast that scales into a business this year, you want to monitor analytics and listener feedback because the whole thing is you're having a conversation with your listeners, okay, and you are paying attention to the analytics because you want to see what works, what doesn't work, and how to really tweak things along the way. And an ongoing itinerary. This itinerary is an ongoing dialogue. This is an ongoing analysis that you should really have. Okay, one thing for sure: the most successful podcasts have an audience that loves the show. Think about Joe Rogan Experience. Think about the Tucker Carlson show. Think about true crime, crime junkie. So that's important. Okay, one key component of in building that affinity between you and your listeners is taking in listener feedback. So use your podcast analytics to dig deeper into your audience and their listening habits. So you want to answer questions like, how do people find your show? What percentage of people see versus listen to your podcast? What podcast format has the highest listener retention? Okay, that's important. And which types of guests have the most downloads? And what day of the week do people tend to listen? So that's kind of cool because what happens here is that you're trying to really synchronize, you're trying to really streamline your listenership. So podcast listening platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcast make this type of analytical strategy very easy. Those platforms have polls and Q&A prompts within the media player, so you can get immediate feedback from listeners on every episode without remembering actually to ask. It's also a good idea to periodically run a listener survey that asks people how they would describe the show, what their favorite episodes are, what they like you to change, and deeper demographic questions that you don't get with podcast analytics. Next, you also want to do something that's very important. You want to monetize your podcast. Okay, it can be really expensive to run a podcast, and if you want to scale it into a business, you got to really bring in the revenue. So, from hosting fees to the time you spend refining each episode, you are able to cover your expenses and become a full-time creator by monetizing your podcast. So, think about podcast ads, affiliate links, as well as products and services. So, if you think about building a podcast this year that scales hopefully into a business, remember that you have to constantly start by defining and researching your audience. Okay, that's going to help you big time because your audience could tell you, for instance, how long your podcast should be and what topic do you want to cover or what topic should you cover. There is no best practice for podcast length per se. Some creators produce daily shows that are 5 minutes long. Others drop monthly episodes that go on for 3 hours. So you want to view your audience retention rate to see when people tend to drop off and go from there, right? People are People tend to drop off around the 1 hour mark. Then you want to have maybe a 1 hour podcast or a 2 hour podcast. I mean, to do a 3 hour podcast or 4 hour podcast, you gotta be as strong and resourceful, okay, strong and resourceful as maybe Joe Rogan, for instance. I mean, Joe Rogan spends 3 hours or 4 hours on his solo interviews, okay, and so that's something to really think about. So you gotta really strategize at that level, especially if you are trying to turn your business into let's say a long term slash durable business, okay. And so you want to constantly think about your audience, but also think about having a narrative for each episode. Storytelling is really important. That's what's going to, let's say, differentiate you from others, okay, in this very competitive industry. You also want to pay attention to something that I want you to really think about, and this is your ability to invest in high quality equipment, because then you'll be able to say, okay, you know what, I think this is good for me, this is not good for me, and I'm comfortable with this, I'm not comfortable with it. It really depends on what you want to really do. So, Dakota, in today's conversation, I spoke to you about how to build a podcast that scales into a business. I gave you the different steps you need to follow. There were 12 of them. And I gave you now Dakota, the conclusion. Thank you so much. God bless you. I will see you next time. Until then, remember, stay marvelous.